Right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to what will be the last part of George's Marvellous Medicine. Sorry, I'm a couple of minutes late this morning. So, a quick recap of what's happened in the story so far, and then we'll get on and read what will be the last couple of chapters. And then we have the Adventures of Captain Underpants, which we can start reading next. So, quick recap. So, George lives with his grandma, and she's really nasty to him, and he's left alone with her. He needs to feed her the medicine, but instead of making the medicine, giving her her medicine, he makes his own, and he puts lots of different things in it, like um, there's hair remover, toothpaste, paint, lots of medicines for animals. And the effect is that it makes her grow really, really tall. She breaks through the top of the house. Then his dad comes home and he says, right, let's give it to the pig and to the cow and to the sheep and the goat, so that they all go really big as well. And then George's dad wants to make it again so that they can sell it and make lots of money out of it, because he thinks that all farmers try to grow big things so they can make more money of them. So they are trying to make it again so they can do that. So they've been around the house, they've collected all the things, and then they're about to start trying to make it. Okay, so this next chapter is called Marvellous Medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. Come along, my boy, said Mr. Killicranky. Which one did you put in first? This one, George said. Golden Gloss hair shampoo. He emptied the bottle into the pan. Now the toothpaste, George went on, and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish. Keep at it, my boy, said Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. Keep putting them in. Don't stop. Don't pause. Don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work. One by one, George poured and squeezed things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the saucepan didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had done the first time. Now what did you do? Cried Mr. Cranky. Did you stir it? I boiled it, George said, but not for long, and I stirred it as well. So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he had used before. It's not brown enough, George said. Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten. What? Cried Mr. Cranky. Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, then it won't work. At least not in the same way. A quart of brown gloss paint, George said. That's what I've forgotten. Mr. Killicranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. Ah, that's better, George said. That's more like the right colour. It's boiling, cried Mr. Cranky. It's boiling and bubbling, George. Is it ready yet? It's ready, George said. At least I hope it is. Right, shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. Let's test it. Let's give some to a chicken. My heavens alive, why don't you calm down a bit, Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. Calm down, Mr. Cranky said. You expect me to calm down? And here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George. Dip a cupful out of the saucepan and get a spoon, and we'll give some to a chicken just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture. Outside in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's marvellous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in that silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of marvellous medicine number 2. Come on, chicken, he said. Good chicken. Chick, 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 chick. A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went, peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. Whoosh! Shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came back down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone inside was sharpening a knife on a grindstone in its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the two thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killiecrankie. "Something's wrong," said George. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sainted ants!" cried Mr. Killiecrankie. "We've got it wrong. This chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken's legs." "I must have left something out," said George. "I know you've left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What is it you left out?" "I've got it," said George. What was it? Quick!" "Flea powder for dogs," said George. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," said George. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too," said George. "Well, no wonder it went wrong," said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy some more flea powder and more shoe polish. Next chapter, Marvellous Medicine number 3. "Here it is," cried Mr. Killiecrankie, rushing into the kitchen. "1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 tin of brown shoe polish." George poured the flea powder into the giant saucepan. Then he scooped the shoe polish out of its tin, and added that as well. "Stir it up, George," shouted Mr. Cranky. "Give it another boil. We've got it this time. I'll bet we've got it." After Marvellous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out into the yard to try it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come and watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Cranky. "Come and watch us turn an ordinary chicken into a great, lovely big one that lays eggs as large as footballs." "I hope you do it better than last time," said Mrs. Cranky, following them out. "Come on, chicken," said George, holding out a spoonful of medicine number 3. "Good chicken, chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine." A magnificent black cockerel with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The cockerel looked at the spoon and it went peck. "Cock-a-doodle-doo!" squawked the cockerel, shooting up into the air and coming down again. "Watch him now!" cried Mr. Cranky. "Watch him grow! Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger." Mr. Killiecrankie, Mrs. Cranky, and little George stood in the yard, staring at the black cockerel. The cockerel stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. "What's happening to its neck?" Mrs. Cranky said. "It's getting longer," said George. "I'll say it's getting longer," said Mrs. Cranky. Mr. Cranky for once said nothing. "Last time it was all legs," Mrs. Cranky said. "Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck." It was an extraordinary sight, but the cockerel's body hadn't grown at all. The neck, though, was now about 6 feet long. "All right, George," Mr. Cranky said. "What else have you forgotten?" "I don't know," George said. "Oh, yes, you do," Mr. Cranky said. "Come along, boy. Think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you've not remembered it." "I put some engine oil in from the garage," George said. "Did you have that on your list?" "Eureka!" cried Mr. Cranky. "That's the answer. How much did you put in?" "Half a pint," George said. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. "And some antifreeze," George called after him. "I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze." Marvellous Medicine number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant saucepan. "Boil it up again," cried Mr. Cranky. "Boil it and stir it." George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget, you don't just have the exact same things as before, but you need to have the exact same amounts of those things. And how can you possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got it this time. You see if we haven't. This was George's marvellous medicine number 4, and when it had boiled for a couple of minutes, George once again carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty queer chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, said Mr. Cranky. Give a spoonful to that one over there. He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held out the spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said, come try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon. Then it went, peck. Ow, Chick said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be too sure, Mrs. Cranky said. Why is it whistling like that? You keep quiet, woman, said Mr. Cranky. Give it a chance. They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Next chapter. Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it could be, said George. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and a cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her, and she shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anyone brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with all the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs, no bacon, no buttered toast. Oh, I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Oh, she cried. Ha, so that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish little pig. No, Grandma, George said. This isn't. Don't you lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, Mrs. Cranky shouted. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter, trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman, and he smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't you think I won't, said Grandma, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, no, Grandma, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't have it. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's Marvellous. Everything's George's round here, shouted Grandma. George's this, George's that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, said Mr. Cranky, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other 2 cried. No, no, no. It was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine #4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to this tiny little brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, cried Mrs. Cranky, glaring at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's let off a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt the ears. Call the fire brigade, said Mrs. Cranky. Call the police. Man the hose pipes. Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shrieked Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough and put your head under the water. But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down fast. Watch this, George, Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. Watch what happens when someone had 50 spoonfuls instead of one. Very soon, Grandma was back to her normal height. Stop, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's just right. But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. How do you feel, Mother? Asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny little face still bore the same foul and furious expression it had always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. How do I feel? She yelled. How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget? She's still going, shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. She's getting smaller. And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her eyes and in her hands, and she cried, How do I stop her getting smaller still? You can't, said Mr. Cranky. She'd had 50 times the right amount. I must stop her, Mrs. Cranky wailed. I can hardly see her as it is. Catch hold of each end of her and pull, said Mr. Cranky. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin. Then a pumpkin seed. Then, and then. Where is she? Cried Mrs. Cranky. I've lost her. Hooray, said Mr. Cranky. She's gone. She's disappeared completely, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered, said Mr. Cranky. Great medicine of yours, George. George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you? But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, Oh, well, I suppose it was for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she? Yes, Mr. Cranky said. She most certainly was. George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments, he had touched with the fiery tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. The end. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. So Tomorrow we will start reading The Adventures of Captain Underpants by Dave Pilkey. So we'll start that again at 10 o'clock tomorrow. So hope everyone is okay. Remember, if you need anything from us, any work, or if you need, if your parents need anything, or if you need us to get any work printed out for you from school that you can collect, then email year4@hovingham.org, and either Mrs. Hall or Mrs. Higgins will get back to you straight away, and we can arrange that for you. Remember to keep challenging us on TT Rockstars as well, and we've put a few challenges out which have been responded to. So that's great. Keep up the good work, guys. Stay safe, and we hope to see you all soon. Okay, take care, guys.